The contents of this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or the U.S. government. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 1 of the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Training, Foundations of Lead Exposure. This is the second segment on the history of lead poisoning and contemporary issues. At the top right, there are pictures featuring a father with a young daughter in his lap, a picture of a mother and child at the doctor's office, and a classroom with diverse students. In the bottom right is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention logo, which also shows that CDC is a part of the Department of Health and Human Services. The purpose of this segment is to provide historical context about lead poisoning and evidence to support continuing vigilance in detecting exposures. In addition, the content should assist trainees in describing the present and past uses of lead, the history and timeline of lead policies in the United States, and the impacts of recent lead exposure incidents within affected communities. The hazards of lead poisoning have been recognized for a very long time. This is an advertisement that appeared in the year 1897, and in the upper right, it states that this paint is not made with lead and is non-poisonous. So, it was known for well over 100 years that putting lead in paint was a pretty bad idea, but it took many years for enactment of regulations that reduce or eliminate lead in consumer products. The first diagnosis of childhood lead paint poisoning came in Brisbane, Australia. An ophthalmologist was concerned that there were too many children who were actually going blind from lead exposure. Initially, his first conclusions that it was the paint and also the dust was ridiculed by his peers, and it wasn't really accepted. However, the evidence accumulated so that in later years, that became clearer. An 1897 advertisement for paint that states Aspinall's enamel is not made with lead and is non-poisonous. Many of you know the recent story of what happened in Flint, Michigan, where the water source was changed without the proper kind of chemical treatment, and the lead in the water pipes entered the drinking water supply and ended up exposing a number of children. The Flint water crisis reminded many that childhood lead poisoning remains a significant issue in the United States. But Flint is not unique. There remain many locations in the United States where lead poisoning remains a significant public health problem. An image of a water tower from Flint, Michigan, and the words Flint water crisis. There are a number of common uses and pathways of exposure for lead. Historically, in addition to water, putting lead in water pipes, of course, it was used in food canning, and in particular, baby formula cans. And then, of course, lead was used as an anti-knock compound in gasoline for decades. Today, looking on the right side of the screen, most of the lead is actually used in battery production. And of course, batteries should be properly recycled. But now it is known that the contaminated settled house dust, and also lead that accumulates in bare soil, and also deteriorated paint, constitute the main sources of exposure. There are also important exposures from demolition, and in recent years there have been alarming reports about toys, spices, and other consumer goods that are contaminated with lead coming from other countries. But lead paint has emerged in most recent years as the primary source of exposure, that is, high exposure, for most kids. Though lead-free house paint is available, there are ongoing exposures from so-called legacy paint, which is old paint that's still in older housing. In addition, worker exposures in certain industries such as battery plants or radiator repair shops continue to pose hazards. Sometimes parents may inadvertently take lead home and expose their own children. And then, lead is still permitted in aviation fuel, so that's also a source of exposure. A Venn diagram showing the intersection between historical and current pathways of lead exposure. Now, this is a rather complicated diagram from the EPA's most recent integrated science experiments on lead. It shows both primary sources and pathways of exposure. Lead is a multimedia pollutant. That is, because of so many uses of lead over so many years, it's come to contaminate air, soil, water, and so forth. However, you'll note on this slide that air and natural waters, paint, and indoor dust are all common exposures. The goal is to interrupt the various pathways of exposure so that human exposure, animal exposure, and plant exposure do not occur. This graphic shows a complex picture of all of these sources and pathways that do matter. Graph showing primary sources and pathways of lead exposure from natural water sediments to drinking water in pipes and how humans, animals, and plants can be exposed. Now, unfortunately, the worldwide production of lead continues to rise. This is from 2018, but it's continued in the intervening years. The evidence indicates that the introduction of new lead-based paint in other countries continues to be a major concern. So, as the world continues to produce lead, the need to control the sources and routes of exposure continues to be an important problem. Line graph showing world lead production from 1960 to 2018 and the millions of tons of lead products made. These are data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is the nation's primary way in which CDC determines the percentage of children who have higher blood lead levels. In the years 2007 to 2010, 2.6% of children had blood lead levels above the reference value, which at that time was 5 micrograms per deciliter. That translates into an estimated 535,000 children with higher blood lead. You'll also see that girls have slightly higher blood lead levels than boys do, 2.8% versus 2.5%. The younger years when children are crawling around more, you'll also see higher blood lead levels at ages of 1 to 2 compared to 3 to 5, so 3.1% to 2.3%. And then among black children, you'll see that 5.6% of them had blood lead levels above the reference value, compared to 1.9 or 2.4 for Mexican Americans and whites respectively. So, this disparity by race and ethnicity remains an important factor in the lead poisoning prevention field. A table comparing children's blood lead levels by demographic characteristics, including sex, age, and race. There are other factors that are particularly important. Looking at the right-hand column, the poverty-to-income ratio, the blood lead level percentage is about 4 times greater for families who live in poverty. The older the housing stock, the greater the chance of lead exposure. Lead exposure is about 5 times higher in pre-1950 housing. When lead in residential paint was finally banned in 1978, lead exposure declined. Medicaid is sort of a marker of poverty and low-income status. Medicaid children have twice the percentage of blood lead level than non-Medicaid children. Income matters, place matters, and some of these disparities remain at the heart of our lead poisoning issue in the United States. A table showing children's blood lead levels by additional demographic characteristics such as poverty, age of housing, and Medicaid enrollment. The CDC's blood lead action level, or level of concern, or today it's called a blood lead reference value that triggers certain action, has declined over the years. Before 1960, the very first Surgeon General's report on this actually stood at 80 micrograms per deciliter of blood. Now to put this in some context, the fatal dose, depending on the age of the child and nutritional status and other characteristics, is somewhere around 150 micrograms per deciliter. As more knowledge was acquired about lower levels of exposure, CDC acted on the evidence and reduced the blood lead level that triggered action. Acting on the evidence, the focus became subclinical measures of intoxication and moved to a level of concern. And then most recently, that term was abandoned because it meant that if you were below a blood lead level of concern, it means you're unconcerned. Well, that's not really correct. If there's an exposure that's above, say, average, then it should be a concern. So, the blood lead reference value was adopted as a more objective, less kind of subjective measure based on the population distribution. Line graph showing blood lead levels and public health actions from 1965 to 2015, and how the lead exposure declined from 60 micrograms per deciliter of blood to 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. As mentioned earlier, the problem of lead paint has existed for a very long time. Even though the first diagnosis of lead paint occurred in Brisbane, Australia, of all places, it wasn't until 1927 that the evidence accumulated to the point that it was recognized that we should ban the use of lead in residential paint. The International Labor Organization issued this convention, which many countries of the world signed on to in 1927. The United States banned lead paint in 1978. However, a recent Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, report estimated that 89% of homes built pre-1978 had lead paint hazards, amounting to approximately 30 million homes, and that over 3 million homes with children under the age of 6 had 1 or more lead hazards. HUD, 2021. Map of Europe showing Great Britain, France, Spain, Greece, Sweden, Bulgaria, Belgium, Estonia, Romania, Austria, Latvia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. This is one picture of lead paint peeling from the walls and ceiling in a home in Wisconsin where a child actually died from lead exposure. Today, thankfully, very few, if any, fatalities from lead paint occur, but it underscores the fact that lead can be a significant death-causing issue if it's not properly controlled. It's a potent neurotoxin. picture showing lead paint peeling from ceiling and walls. Now, this is another picture of lead paint. As you all know, when you get an X-ray, you wear a lead apron. It turns out that lead is radio-opaque, and so in this radiograph of a child's abdomen, these little white specks there are actually lead-based paint chips that the child has ingested. For many years, this was thought to be the primary route of exposure. That is, the children had to eat paint chips and then suffer the consequences. And certainly this remains a significant route of exposure. But today, this is not the way in which most children are exposed to toxic doses of lead. In fact, it's from ingesting much smaller, often invisible, lead dust particles. X-ray of a child's abdomen with white specks of lead-based paint chips highlighted. The problem is that lead paint is old. It's been with us for a long time, but sadly it's not history. It's still with us, and we need to take further action. Picture of a newspaper highlighting the top story that lead paint is old, but it's not history. Again, this is the traditional view. That is, until the mid-'80s, paint chips were thought to be the main route of exposure. The paint had to be deteriorated, and children had to ingest it, and again, eating or chewing on protruding surfaces. Picture of a child peeling paint chips from a wall. It was also thought that children chewing on protruding surfaces would cause ingestion. Picture of an old windowsill with peeling paint chips. It is currently recognized that it is the subtle dust and the hand-to-mouth contact that all children engage in that are, in fact, the primary routes of exposure for most children today. Fingertips with lead dust. So that's kind of depicted in this particular slide. You see the cover of Newsweek. This is in 1991, and it shows the kind of activity that all children kind of engage in. There was a big public outcry about this based on new estimates of the millions of children who were actually exposed to this problem. It led Congress to develop a new law that reflected the new science and defined where the lead-based paint hazard actually was. It wasn't just the presence of lead paint, but it was in certain pathways. Public health professionals acted to prevent exposure. Cover of Newsweek magazine showing a little girl and stating disturbing new evidence about potential lead threats to children's health. This graph shows the blue line is the geometric mean blood lead levels going back to the 70s, and these are the policies that were put in place to reduce lead exposure. In 1971, Congress passed the Lead-Based Paint Poisoning Prevention Act, which addressed lead exposure in residential housing. In 1989, public housing was the first class of housing to be required to undergo inspection and abatement. In 1992, Title X of the Housing and Community Development Act, which today remains the nation's main lead poisoning prevention law, was passed. There was a ban on lead solder and food canning in the mid-90s. By 1996, persons selling or leasing most residential housing built before 1978 were required to provide purchasers and renters with a federally approved lead hazard information pamphlet and to disclose known lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards. In 2012, CDC lowered the blood lead reference value from the old level of concern from 10 to 5 micrograms per deciliter. And currently, the blood lead reference value is 3.5 micrograms per deciliter of blood, which is the 97.5th percentile of the blood lead distribution in U.S. children ages 1 to 5 years. Timeline of U.S. lead policies from 1970 to 2016, including the Lead Contamination Act of 1988, the 1995 ban of lead in canned food solder, and the 2011 update on lead in children's products rule. So, the question is, has the lead problem really been solved? This is Claire Patterson's work, published in 1991. Claire Patterson was a geophysicist who estimated the age of the Earth. But to do that, he used lead isotopes, and he had a problem because his samples kept getting contaminated from routine exposure. So he came up with this depiction showing that prehistoric humans were largely uncontaminated by industrial lead. Today, the typical American has much higher exposures compared with prehistoric humans. Each dot in these diagrams represents about 40 micrograms of lead for a 70-kilogram person. The figure on the left has 1 dot and represents a prehistoric man. The figure in the middle has 1,000 dots and represents the typical American at the time of the study. The figure on the right with 4,000 dots represents a person with clinical lead poisoning. 3 drawings representing human figures comparing ancient lead exposure to current lead exposure. So in later years, Russ Flegel conducted research building on Claire Patterson's. He looked at lead in prehistoric human bones. He tried to determine what the so-called background level, or prehistoric background level, was. So on this slide, if you look on the left, and this is a log scale on the y-axis, you'll see that the natural blood lead level is shown in the lower left of the screen, and then bone lead is on the x-axis. So you'll see here that blood lead and bone lead are related to each other, and that's because the body treats lead like calcium. So much of it is either excreted or ends up in the bones, so we focus primarily on developmental toxicity. This figure indicates that blood lead concentrations of contemporary humans are significantly above natural levels. Graph comparing lead in humans and laboratory rats indicating that concentrations of lead in humans are above natural levels. To translate all of that, based on the research that Flegel conducted, the so-called natural background blood lead level was estimated to be 0.016 micrograms per deciliter. Natural background lead is basically 100 times lower than today's estimates. Even though tremendous progress has been made, much work lies ahead. There still remain significant exposures that are continuing, and the important thing is that no one has been able to demonstrate a safe blood lead level. There remains important work to eliminate these exposures that are still far above where our ancestors were. Bar graph showing comparison of natural background lead to exposure in 1994 and 2002. There has been important progress since 1976, when the first National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES, was conducted. The geometric mean blood lead level declined from 12.8 to less than 1 microgram per deciliter. It's a decline of 93%. So the methods of controlling exposures have worked. They just have not been taken to scale, and lead exposure still remains an important problem. In public health, there are 3 primary levels of prevention. Oftentimes, the focus is on what's called tertiary prevention. In the lead field, that means treating children with blood lead levels that are far above the blood lead reference value, typically about 45 micrograms per deciliter, by chelating them. Chelation means an administration of the drug to bind lead and hopefully remove it from the body. However, that's of limited effectiveness and is only used in severe cases. A secondary prevention means monitoring blood lead levels to identify children who've been exposed, and then hopefully taking some action regarding follow-up care and referrals, and remediating whatever their exposure happens to be. Ideally, primary prevention is most desirable. Primary prevention is preventing the problem at the beginning, before the child is exposed. That's in fact the most effective way to ensure that children do not suffer these long-term harmful effects of lead exposure. The ultimate goal is primary prevention. Because of limited resources, secondary prevention and tertiary prevention may be undertaken, but primary prevention is an important tool for public health. There are considerations for primary prevention. Clinicians should do what they do best. They should monitor blood levels in children, but of course, most physicians are not trained to identify pathways of exposure in housing. That is the job of risk assessors, who are licensed by most states, or, if the state doesn't license them, by the EPA. But those folks are trained to identify exposure sources, and then also recommend what should be done to fix it, to make sure that the home is in fact safe for the child. And sometimes, of course, there are other sources of exposure that are not home-based. But we know that about 70% of children who have higher blood lead levels come from housing-related sources. The case for primary prevention is pretty clear. Public health practitioners have made significant progress. However, the current exposures still remain too high. Over 500,000 children under the age of 6 have blood lead levels higher than the reference value. Thus, there are missed opportunities for prevention. A scale weighing cost versus benefits. A few years back, the Pew Charitable Trust and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation produced a cost-benefit analysis to determine the results of actually eliminating lead exposure for the entire 2018 birth cohort. The results of the analysis indicated an economic benefit of at least $84 billion. Most of that is, in fact, due to increased lifetime earnings. Lead can reduce IQ. On average, people with lower IQs make less over their lifetime than people with higher IQs, and so that's the bulk of the benefit. But there are also important financial benefits in healthcare savings, in schools, fewer children in special education, and in quality-adjusted life years. Most of the benefits would flow to households and the private sector, but an important share would also go to federal, state, and local governments in the form of increased tax revenues. A table showing cost savings for primary prevention of lead, including $1.7 billion in health savings and $1.9 billion in education savings. There are limits to secondary and tertiary prevention. The action is postponed until after the exposure. Only one house is remediated at a time after the discovery of the lead hazard. And the use of chelation therapy really isn't a cure. There's no medical cure for lead poisoning. Really, prevention of exposure is in fact the best medicine, and many children are too old by the time they're screened to get the full benefit of prevention. This is a Pew Charitable Trust Cost-Benefit Analysis report. It's called 10 Policies to Prevent Childhood Lead Poisoning, and it still remains an important, robust economic analysis, and the point is that the benefits far outweigh the costs. This report basically had a series of recommendations based on the evidence, and it turned out that the highest return on investment would be by enforcing the EPA's renovation, repair, and painting rule. It turns out that for every dollar invested in improved enforcement, at least $3 in benefits are returned. And that's probably an underestimate because certain benefits are intangible and not counted, like stress, litigation, property maintenance, and the like. If lead paint hazards are removed from low-income housing, especially where lead paint is most concentrated in housing built before 1960, it makes economic sense to make this investment. For each dollar invested, $1.39 is returned. The same applies for each dollar invested in lead prevention in drinking water. About $1.33 is returned. Removing lead from certain food and other consumer products and reducing air lead emissions from things like aviation fuel has economic and social benefits. This report provides important information and recommendations. An image of the EPA report, 10 Policies to Prevent and Respond to Childhood Lead Exposure. The other recommendations include 1. Cleaning up contaminated soil to improve blood lead testing. Sadly, it still remains the case that most children in the early years are not tested for blood lead, and so many children exposed to lead are missed. 2. Early intervention and remediation for these children may be delayed as a result. 3. Improvements in access to developmental and neuropsychological tests in the early years are required to help overcome some of the effects of lead exposure, at least partially, and to provide high-quality referral programs for children who unfortunately have already suffered higher blood lead levels. 4. That means improving public access to local housing and environmental data, and also 5. Continuing to do research to better target state and local efforts. This is the nation's main lead poisoning prevention law. It is Title 10 of the 1992 Housing and Community Development Act, also known as the Residential Lead Paint Hazard Reduction Act. Basically, it required key duties at HUD, EPA, OSHA, and other agencies. For HUD, it required reform of all federally assisted housing. It mandated disclosure of lead paint hazards. That means if a home seller or landlord knew about a lead paint hazard, it had to be disclosed to new occupants moving into a home. It required certain research activities at both HUD and EPA. EPA was charged with creating standards of exposure, that is, exposure limits for dust, soil, and existing paint. The disclosure was actually a joint regulation from HUD and EPA, as well as conducting research and then what I call here infrastructure needs. That means licensing of lead professionals, whether they are inspectors or risk assessors or abatement contractors. The law required the EPA to create proper training mechanisms so that people who were involved in doing this work were doing it right. When Title 10 was passed, there were no real standards to protect construction workers from lead exposure while they were doing the remediation. Other agencies also had certain duties under this law. During the 90s, most of the requirements in the legislation were implemented. A picture of men in hazmat suits removing lead hazards from a house. Some of the definitions under Title 10 include risk assessments, which determine the presence of lead-based paint hazards, that is, deteriorated lead paint, contaminated dust, or contaminated bare soil. Inspections, which are measurements typically by X-ray fluorescence, look at 100 to 150 surfaces in the home to find out where lead-based paint is present or absent, regardless of the condition of the home. It also defined so-called target housing. This means housing that is likely to contain lead paint before it was banned in 1978, where children are most likely to live. So certain classes of housing, like housing dedicated exclusively for the elderly, wouldn't be considered target housing, but the vast majority of pre-1978 housing is. Before Title 10, there were no health-based exposure limits. There were no standard ways of doing lead inspections or abatement, and some of the early abatement procedures actually did more harm than good. Some of the paint removal methods turned out to be more dangerous. Labs analyzing paint, dust, or soil samples had no quality control or quality assurance program. For X-ray fluorescence devices that measured lead paint in situ, that is, as it was on walls or other surfaces, there was no real performance criteria. There was no trained or licensed workforce, no occupational standards, no real standardizing training curricula or public education programs. Back then, it was actually legal to hide lead paint hazards. And most importantly, perhaps, there was no federal funding to address hazards where they were most prevalent, which is in low-income, privately owned, high-risk housing. So all of these improvements were mandated by Title X. Before Title X, there were certain paint removal methods that did more harm than good. Open flame burning, power sanding, abrasive blasting, and dry scraping. All produce very high dust lead levels. On the right, a cartoon blowtorch. This is a picture of a study conducted many years ago, and this is a great way to remove lead paint. It's really fast, right? And initially the thought was, let's just get lead paint out of the house as quickly as possible. But in this case, the workers' exposures were extremely high. They were estimated at about 11,000 micrograms per cubic meter. A man in a hazmat suit burning lead paint to remove it. Burning is a great way to quickly remove lead paint, but it creates a lead fume, which turns into settled dust. So not only were these workers exposed, but the children who were later moving into these housing units also became overexposed from the dust that remained behind, even though there was some sort of rudimentary cleaning. These methods are now banned. There are much safer ways to deal with lead paint. A man in a hazmat suit removing lead paint. Under EPA standards, a lead-based paint hazard means that the lead paint is deteriorated. It's on a friction surface where there's high dust present that is above the hazard levels, or lead paint is damaged or not intact, or it's been chewed on, or there's settled dust or soil that is above the hazard levels. A lot of scientific inquiry went into determining the standards. Picture of a little girl looking at lead paint chips on a windowsill. Today, those standards are 10 micrograms per square foot on floors, measured by wipe sampling, or 100 micrograms per square foot on windowsills. For existing lead paint in housing, the standard is at 1 milligram per square centimeter, or 5,000 parts per million. However, the milligram per square centimeter is the preferred metric because it's independent of the number of layers of non-leaded paint, so it's not confounded by it, unlike the weight percent or the parts per million level. In 2001, EPA defined a soil lead hazard as 400 parts per million over bare soil in play areas, and 1,200 parts per million for bare soil in the rest of the yard. Over time, a number of these standards have been reassessed, and they're continually being updated based on what we're learning in new science. The 1,200 parts per million is not used by public health officials, and the use of 400 parts per million as a screening level in residential soil is being reconsidered because of the new version of EPA's Integrated Exposure Uptake Biokinetic (IEUBK) model for lead in children. They will likely change in the future as we learn more. HUD also adopted what are called clearance requirements. There are dust lead levels that are allowed after the cleanup has been done. These are the levels that will protect most, not all, but most children, so they're similar to the hazard standards. EPA has adopted most of these with the exception of porch floors, which basically are a standard 40 micrograms per square foot. These standards are for HUD's lead paint grantees under the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Control, LHC, and the Lead Hazard Reduction Grant Programs, LHRD, which identify and control lead-based paint hazards in eligible privately owned housing for rental or owner occupants. This has been in place for a number of years now. Window troughs are areas of the window between the sash and the storm windows, so it's an exterior surface area. That area should also be cleaned up, since there's an important amount of exposure there. Under the disclosure rule, which was mandated by Title X before anyone is obligated under a lease or sales contract, landlords have to provide a lead hazard warning statement and a pamphlet. If they know about a lead paint hazard, then they have to disclose it. It doesn't require a testing of a lead paint situation, unlike France, where they do require lead testing at the time of property turnover. But in this country, if there's been a test for a child who's been poisoned, then that evidence has to be disclosed to the new buyer. That's so that new people moving in would know what they're getting into, much like any other housing defect. And then the buyer or the tenant is supposed to sign a statement saying that they received the pamphlet and if there are records of a hazard, that they actually got it. This is a picture of the pamphlet. Those of you who've recently bought or moved into an older home should have gotten this. If you didn't, it would be considered a violation of the disclosure rule. This became effective in 1996, and it's still required today. Also, there's a certain standard language that has to be attached to the lease so that it's actually a legal requirement. The pamphlet is a valuable tool for identification and remediation of homes in large numbers. Picture of an EPA pamphlet showing a family, baby, and housing units on how to protect your family from lead exposure in your home. This is the first case ever in which a rental property manager was prosecuted for failing to notify a tenant about a lead-based paint hazard. James T. Annickstein of Manchester, New Hampshire, was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment. Annickstein and his company, JTA Real Estate Brokerage and Property Management Incorporated, previously pleaded guilty to obstructing justice, making false statements, and failing to provide tenants with notice of lead-based paint hazards. Annickstein and JTA were also ordered to pay a $40,000 fine. The defendants failed to warn the mother of a 2-year-old about the lead hazards in her Manchester apartment, and the child subsequently died of lead intoxication on April 21, 2000. 3 pictures. On the left, a child exposed to lead. In the middle, the child's funeral, and on the right, the child's tombstone. This is the rough timeline. It took a while to figure out that she died from lead. There was an EPA inspection of JTA Real Estate Brokers, which was the property management firm that made false statements to the EPA. There was also no lead paint disclosure form initially available, so EPA filed for information. There was a grand jury with a series of subpoenas back and forth, execution of a search warrant, and a conviction. As a result of the conviction, the defendants hired an independent contractor who determined where lead-based paint hazards existed in their owned properties and provided all tenants with new lead-based paint notices. The case was investigated by EPA's Criminal Investigation Division with forensic assistance from the U.S. Secret Service. A major finding from the on-site investigation was that the lead-based paint disclosure form, which was supposedly signed by the tenant, was determined to be a forgery. The date of the signature was listed as before the date the form was created. James T. Annickstein and his company, JTA Real Estate Brokerage and Property Management, pleaded guilty to charges of obstructing justice, making false statements to investigators, and failing to provide prospective tenants with lead-based paint, or LBP, disclosure information as required by federal law. So, part of your duties in the lead poisoning prevention field will be about enforcing this particular rule, which is not just a federal matter. It can also be done at the local level. Picture of an EPA lead paint disclosure form. What works in actually reducing lead-based paint hazards? These are the guidelines for the evaluation and control of lead-based paint hazards, which includes the procedures for conducting remediation, inspections, or assessing hazards properly. Snapshot of a HUD Guidelines report for the evaluation and control of lead-based paint hazards. The guidelines, issued by the Office of Healthy Homes and Lead Hazard Control of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, are referenced in many state and local regulations and EPA regulations. The guidelines outline how to conduct an inspection or a risk assessment, how to conduct abatements, which means a permanent solution to a lead problem, or how to do what's called interim controls, which you may think of as specialized maintenance to also eliminate the hazards, but probably for a shorter period of time. The guidelines also provide information on proper cleaning during and after abatement. Many contractors may not understand that lead dust particles may not be visible to the naked eye, and those small dust particles are most easily absorbed into the child's body. This is why clearance testing after cleanup is important. This is the dust testing center after the cleanup to make sure the housing unit is safe for children to occupy. There also are requirements for both protecting occupants while the work is underway and also protecting workers. There are also special procedures for how to evaluate children who have blood lead levels above the current reference value, because there might be other sources of exposure. That last chapter in the guidelines was written in collaboration with CDC. The table on this slide presents data from HUD's National Lead Paint Survey, known as the American Healthy Housing Survey. If you focus on the far right-hand column, this is the oldest housing. There may be a perception that all paint in older housing is lead paint. Well, these data show that that's not really true. See that pre-1940, windows and doors have the highest rates of lead paint, but it's only about 30 to 40%. So that means that 60 to 70% of surfaces, even in the older housing stock, do not have lead paint. And so that's why the inspection and the risk assessments focus the attention on where the hazards are most likely to be found. The source of lead may or may not be the house paint. Focusing the inspection and assessment is important to locate the actual source of exposure and target the remediation appropriately. Table showing interior and exterior surfaces lead paint prevalence data pre-1940 to 1998 from a HUD national survey. After Congress passed Title X, scientists and others wanted to make sure that the newer methods of remediation were actually working. So this is a study conducted with the University of Cincinnati that assessed 3,000 housing units in 14 jurisdictions across the country. Results showed that blood lead levels declined by 37% over 2 years following remediation. After the 2-year point, some parents grew tired of having to subject their children to blood draws for lead testing. After that time, the study assessed dust lead levels over a longer period of time in a subset of houses. Line graph showing lead decline following 2 years after an abatement program. These are the results of a study that evaluated the relationship between residential window replacements and lead dust. The authors analyzed data from 189 homes in 4 cities that were part of the HUD Lead Hazard Control Grant program. Overall, the floor and sill lead dust adjusted mean was reduced at least 85% between pre-intervention and the 12 years since the windows were replaced. Homes with all the windows replaced had 41% lower lead floor dust and 51% lower lead windowsill dust than homes with no window replacements. Homes that had some of their windows replaced had 28% lower lead floor dust and 37% lower lead windowsill dust than homes with no window replacements. The authors also estimated that there was an estimated $1,700 to $2,000 economic benefit for replacing windows. Line graph showing 12-year-old follow-up after window replacement program. In general, this is the family of exposure controls. Whatever we're doing to eliminate lead, we make sure to protect the occupants of the building and the workers. Paint stabilization is a specialized short-term maintenance action that eliminates hazards if it's done correctly. Building component replacement, such as windows and doors, is a permanent solution because the lead paint on those surfaces is gone. During the replacement process, caution must be observed to avoid creating lead dust during removal. There are certain paint removal methods that can be done safely using certain types of chemicals, low heat, and certain contained abrasive methods. Encapsulation is use of specialized coating that's warranted for at least 20 years. Enclosure means creating a barrier, like new drywall or new siding, that creates a permanent barrier between the child's living space and the lead paint. Whether you're doing paint stabilization or abatement methods, cleanup is required. Then, clearance testing is done to make sure that the house is in fact safe. So that's all outlined in the HUD guidelines. It's actually much more complicated than this, but these are the general steps that need to be taken. Clearance testing in particular is really important. It's not only dust testing, it's a visual assessment to make sure that the work that is specified is actually done and is done correctly. The smaller lead dust particles are the most important, and they're often invisible. They can only be detected with a wipe sample and follow-up laboratory analysis. It has been shown over many years now that if property owners repair peeling paint without the clearance testing, this increases the risk of a child's exposure to lead. Clearance testing must be done to make sure the housing unit has been corrected safely and has not actually increased exposure. This was a study conducted in Illinois a number of years ago called the ClearWin Study. It's an acronym. ClearWin means Comprehensive Lead Education and Reduction Through Window Replacement. The results showed a significant reduction in lead dust 1 year after the window replacement in windowsills, and showed a significant reduction in floor dust, which is the surface that most children contact most frequently. This was a state-level program that led to a number of jurisdictions focusing on window replacement. Bar graph showing reduction in lead dust 1 year after window replacement. A cost-benefit analysis was also conducted to assess how much it cost to replace the windows, how many windows were replaced, and the associated health and energy benefits. Overall, new windows are more energy efficient. The authors subtracted the cost, $3,451,841, from the estimated benefited $5,912,219 to determine there was a net benefit of $2,460,378. In addition, the average amount of lead dust residents experienced decreased by 44%. Residents reported fewer lead dust-related issues, such as ear infections and allergies or hay fever. It also turns out that people like new windows, so the value of the home actually increased on the market. 87% of residents were satisfied with the replacements. A table showing economic benefits of window replacement in an Illinois study. Now there's a problem in the housing market. If you do a healthy home investment, like lead abatement or asthma remediation or mold remediation, the market doesn't always recognize how to reflect that in the housing price. Healthy home improvement is unlike any other home improvement. If you have a hole in the roof or an old furnace and you replace it, the appraiser will come in and they know what it'll take to replace an older furnace or fix a leaky roof. But currently there are no estimates for lead poisoning abatement. Market vehicles that provide incentives to promote investment in lead poisoning prevention and promotion of healthy homes should be identified and considered to ensure availability of healthy, safe housing. Subsidies and enforcement can be used to address abatement in some older homes, but increasingly, market vehicles such as green building standards that consider housing deficiencies such as lead paint that can be factored into the housing price should be utilized. We must also consider the cost of not making homes healthier. Certified experts are involved in lead abatement. Also, tradespeople and the public are involved, including painters, remodelers, electricians, landlords, banks, homeowners, and the like. Lots of people are involved in lead abatement, and they must have the tools that they need to make sure it's done properly. People who perform renovation or painting projects that disturb lead paint in homes or child care centers or schools that were built before 1978 must be certified and properly trained to make sure they're working in a lead-safe manner. These are not abatement contractors, but they are people who are potentially disturbing lead paint, so they need to be trained properly. Lead paint is still being sold in at least 39 countries that we know of, so it remains an important problem internationally. The World Health Organization and the United Nations Environment Program have launched a global alliance to end lead paint, and they are, along with many people, actively engaged in trying to promote local laws that prohibit the use of lead paint for residential use, like we have here in the United States. Some U.S. companies are still making lead paint in other countries. This is a study that Scott Clark conducted many years ago. He bought paint in China, India, Malaysia, and Singapore. The table shows the median and the maximum lead content in paint. All three countries exceed the United States' allowable limit of lead in new paint, or 90 parts per million. The maximum for India is 187,000 parts per million. This remains a major problem in other countries, and something that the United States is working on with WHO, the United Nations, and others to reduce lead exposure. 66% of new paint samples from China, India, and Malaysia were found to contain 5,000 parts per million, 0.5%, or more of lead, which is the U.S. definition of lead-based paint in existing housing. And 78% of the samples contained 600 parts per million, 0.06%, or more, the U.S. limit for new paints. If you're interested in the paint and lead industry, there's a wonderful history about what they did in the 20s and 30s and earlier years. It's called Deceit and Denial by two historians. They also put out a coloring book for girls and boys that's called The Dutch Boys Lead Party. It said you can chase away old man gloom and make your homes bright and sanitary with white lead paint. Kind of amazing when you think about it. If you're interested in the history, pick up the book and check it out. Pictures of 1920s paint advertisements showing Dutch Boys Lead Party. During national emergencies, we are likely to spend more time at home, and if there are home hazards, like lead paint hazards for example, that more time at home might mean an increased exposure. Housing should be thought of as part of our shared commons and part of our infrastructure. It's not just a private place, but it's something that we buy and sell with each other, and if we don't treat it as a common resource, we'll continue to pay the price. The availability of affordable housing is becoming a crisis, so the issue of making sure that our housing stock is in fact safe and healthy is still very much front and center. In addition, in recent years, global lead poisoning prevention and an international healthy homes movement have emerged. Just a couple of years ago, WHO produced the first ever international healthy housing guidelines, so the process is underway to make sure that member states can adopt safe guidelines for their own housing stock. The graph on the slide summarizes the results of a study of blood lead testing interruptions in 2020 in 34 jurisdictions in the United States. Compared with testing in 2019, testing during January through May 2020 decreased by 34%, with 480,172 fewer children tested. An estimated 9,603 children with higher BLL were missed because of decreased BLL testing. Despite geographic variability, all health departments reported fewer children tested for BLL after the COVID-19 emergency declaration, March through May 2020. In addition, health departments reported difficulty conducting medical follow-up and environmental investigations for children with higher BLLs because of staffing shortages and constraints on home visits associated with the pandemic. Graph showing blood lead testing declined from 2019 to 2020. Recent developments include housing emerging as part of our infrastructure. There's been a national campaign put in place to find the lead paint and to fix it. An updated blood lead reference value reflects the new science. In California, half the counties sued the lead paint companies, and they finally agreed to pay for the remediation of about half the houses in the state. And in Milwaukee, there was a relatively recent decision where 3 children were severely lead poisoned. The paint companies were held responsible for that, so there are new resources coming on board. There are Medicaid and CHIP waivers available to promote remediation in housing for both lead pipes and lead paint. Also, improved surveillance is being developed. Recently, we've seen dramatic increases in appropriations for CDC, HUD, and EPA to address lead exposure prevention. A bar graph showing lead poisoning prevention investments from 3 federal agencies from 2000 to 2020. Investments declined in 2012 and increased in 2020. In conclusion, there are some things that you can do. We need to make sure we know where the high-risk housing is. We need to publicize how to make sure that ongoing maintenance and rehab is done in a lead-safe way. We need to make sure that people have the information they need to protect themselves. Housing inspections should, whether it's for code or other purposes, check for lead in paint, dust, soil, and water. Many housing inspections still do not, but increasingly, more jurisdictions are adopting it as part of their housing codes. And then we need to make sure that families have the information they need through the disclosure pamphlet and evidence of previous inspections to take the right action to protect their children. I'll close with this. Mark Porcus is a veterinarian who treats our bald eagles and other wildlife. But these eagles have died from lead poisoning because they ingested game contaminated with lead shot. So I put it to you. This is our nation's symbol. Is this what we want? Picture of dead bald eagles exposed to lead, and on the right, a picture of 2 veterinarians. In 1974, Donald Barltrop offered this quote, "Until effective standards for the domestic environment are devised, it is likely that children will continue to be employed as biological indicators of substandard housing. Because lead exposure prevention is complicated, public health professionals are looking for new ways to improve outcomes. As part of their problem solving, they must account for health equity issues such as housing and water access. As an article in the American Journal of Public Health asserts, childhood lead exposure prevention should be a national priority, and the time for action is now." Picture of a little girl sitting on a front step surrounded by old peeling paint. Here are a few conclusions. Additional resources are needed to provide prevention services to more children. Exposure control is assessed not by waiting for a child's blood lead level to get to a specific level, but by comparing them to scientifically validated environmental exposure limits. If we delay implementing an environmental control strategy, then we will continue to absorb the cost of lead poisoning in literally billions of dollars that could be avoided, as well as, of course, the unnecessary suffering. I want to note that this presentation was developed in collaboration with Dr. David Jacobs, Chief Scientist at the National Center for Healthy Housing, and the former Director of Lead Poisoning Prevention Program and the Healthy Homes Program at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. However, the contents of this presentation don't necessarily represent the views of CDC or the Academy, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or the U.S. government. Thank you for viewing Module 1, Segment 2. For questions or comments regarding this segment, please send an email to leadinfo@cdc.gov. and indicate Training Question Module 1, Segment 2 in the subject line.